And as more and more folks do get vaccinated, mask mandates in certain places are starting to end. As Asha Staples explained, starting today, those fully vaccinated in Jefferson Parish will not need to wear masks to get into certain buildings.
Jefferson Parish announced on Sunday that anyone that is now fully vaccinated will no longer have to wear a mask inside of government buildings. According to the Louisiana Department of Health and the CDC's new guidelines, anyone who is fully vaccinated no longer has to wear a mask indoors or outdoors or social distance from others. As far as private businesses, they can still implement their own mask guidelines. And similar news out of the city of New Orleans. Officials announced that fully vaccinated people will also no longer be required to mask up or practice social distancing. While there is no way of knowing who's vaccinated, these new rules are based on the honor system, and Mayor LaToya Cantrell is using this no mask mandate as a push to get more people vaccinated.
The virus is still amongst us, but those individuals who have not been vaccinated are at a greater risk. Now is the time to get vaccinated. There's no excuse in the city of New Orleans as it relates to the accessibility of vaccines.
People that have not received a vaccine are asked to continue wearing masks and social distance for their safety. Health officials said the vaccine is the best bet for protection from the virus. Reporting in Jefferson Parish, Asha Staples, Eyewitness News.